Poseidon Triton may be the most well-designed and carefully considered road bike for beginners on the market today. I know it's a pretty bold statement, but it's not just because it's under $1,000 US, which, believe it or not, is actually on the lower end for a well-spec'd bike, but there are just several really smart decisions that went into the design of this bike, and in this video I'll share all those things along with the things that I like and the very few things that I dislike about it. And for those curious, I am not affiliated with Poseidon. Poseidon also haven't seen this video before it went live, nor did they have any input on its content. So the Triton was actually the first bike that Poseidon released years ago, but the latest version is a complete redesign. It's basically an entirely new bike. I'll briefly summarize the specs here. It's an alloy-framed, carbon-forked, road-oriented bike with through axles, and it comes in 6 sizes ranging from extra small to 2XL. Features a Microshift Sword 2x10 drivetrain with 50-34 chainrings up front and an 11-38 tooth cassette in the back for some very respectable range. The brakes are mechanical Tektro brakes with compressionless housing installed at the factory. Now this is actually a pretty big deal, but we'll talk more about this in just a little bit. The wheels are 700C and the tires are tubeless ready Maxxis Pursuer 700C by 32mm slicks for a really nice comfortable ride. The finishing kit is pretty basic, but it does the job. Alloy 27.2mm seat post and some Pro Max drop bars in 44cm width with the size specific stem, meaning for medium and smaller frames you get a 100mm stem, for size large and above you get a 110mm stem. Now this demo unit is a size medium and it weighs in at 22.5 pounds with no pedals, which is decently light for a bike in this class. Now I do realize that the title of this video is pretty bold, I'll admit, but I actually do believe that there are several key elements that really make the Triton stand out among other budget-conscious road bikes. Now the first is the geometry. Being a budget-conscious brand, Poseidon took care not to try and replicate the geometry of an elite racer's road bike, and so the Triton's geometry is a lot more relaxed, putting the rider in a slightly more upright position, prioritizing comfort over some lofty aero gains that no novice cyclist will actually benefit from. In fact, if you compare the Triton to an all-road bike, like the Blackheart All-Road Aluminum, the geometry numbers are actually quite similar. Stack and reach numbers are pretty comparable, and the Triton has shorter chainstays and a more responsive trail figure, but one could argue that the Triton is actually closer to a modern-day all-road bike than a pure road bike. Now this is further reinforced by the fact that the Triton, again which is advertised as a road bike, can fit up to a 40mm tire up front and a 37mm tire in the back, which is easily stepping into gravel bike territory. The Triton even ships with 32mm wide road slicks, which is not the typical tire a road bike is spec'd with, but I think it makes total sense. The trend toward wider tires run at lower pressures is prevalent in the gravel space, and more so in the road space as well. And it's nice to see Poseidon speccing a wider than usual tire from the factory. The long-standing notion of skinny high-pressure tires being faster is all but obsolete in 2024, and so I think a 32mm tire, especially for a newer cyclist who will benefit from the additional comfort and grip, is a total win. And then of course, if the owner of the Triton eventually gets the itch to explore some trails and dabble in gravel, there's no need to get a new bike since the Triton will easily take a set of 35mm knobby tires. Now this, combined with the slightly more relaxed geometry compared to a more traditional road bike, makes it a perfect dual-purpose bike, further adding to its value. Now the next really smart choice that I think sets this bike apart is the group set. I'll start with the drivetrain. It's the Microshift Sword 2x10 road group, and like I mentioned in my review of the Sword group, it's really hard to find any flaws with this system. It is a budget group set, but it's unapologetically modeled after the super popular Shimano GRX group, but it's more affordable and employs mechanical disc brakes rather than hydraulics. The shifts are really crisp and they feel really good when riding. The Sword group set, I think, is just miles beyond any comparable drivetrain on the market. I also think the gearing choice here is really smart. The 50-34 tooth chainrings up front are fairly tall for a novice cyclist, but Poseidon decided to pair it with an 11-38 tooth cassette in the back. Now this is much larger than the typical 11-32 or even 11-34 tooth cassettes normally found on road bikes. And keep in mind, the larger the cassette is in the rear, the easier it will be to climb steep hills. So the fact that Poseidon chose an 11-38 tooth cassette represents a thoughtful decision to appeal to a more entry-level cyclist who would benefit from the lower gear ratios. And then there's the brakes. Now this is really, in my opinion, Poseidon going above and beyond to create a lot of value in the Triton. So the brakes are mechanical and the calipers are a pretty basic Tektro MD C550 caliper. Now, mechanical brakes on drop bar bikes generally suffer from a lack of sensitivity, and the lever action is typically pretty stiff due to the friction in the housing. The brake feel is also typically regarded as vague and kind of mushy in many instances, so I was really excited when I saw that the Triton is now shipping with compressionless brake housing pre-installed at the factory. Now that's just really nice to see. I really don't think I've seen another production bike at this level come with a high quality housing like this. And to be frank, it makes a huge difference. You wouldn't think that changing the brake housing could make that big of a difference, but I'll leave a link to another video I did comparing brake performance with and without compressionless housing, and it's really a step up. The brakes on the Triton feel confident and powerful from the first ride out. Normally on a budget road bike with mechanical brakes, you almost always need to brake from the drops where you have a little bit more leverage on the brake lever. But with the Triton, I had all the power that I needed from the hoods, which to me is a great sign. Typically, my metric for sufficient braking power is whether or not I can lock up the rear tire and skid while seated while braking from the hoods. And on the Triton, it's really not a problem at all. Now, of course, all these design elements are good in theory, but the bike also has to handle well and feel fun to ride. During the testing period, I got to ride the Triton in a number of different scenarios, from long flat miles to hilly climbs and even some winding descents. And through it all, the Triton was seriously a joy to ride. The frame is aluminum, which some equate to having a harsh ride, but then again, the tires on the Triton are 32 millimeters wide, and I ran them at about 50 psi, and any notion of a harsh, unforgiving frame just kind of melted away. The Triton with 32 millimeter tires rides really smooth, and I was never feeling like I wanted a softer or smoother ride. And despite the more relaxed body position that the geometry offers, the chainstays are still really short and the trail is relatively small, which yield a very responsive bike. The Triton maneuvers really well, and you do get a sense of direct efficiency through the pedals. Now, of course, it's not as fast as a dedicated road bike, but that's not really the goal of the Triton. I think this bike balances comfort and performance really well, and it's very well designed for its intended owner, which is likely someone who's relatively new to road cycling or on a budget, or both. Okay, so that's a lot of positive things to say about a sub $1,000 entry-level road bike. So what are the things that I didn't like about the bike? Well, there aren't that many things that I can dock the bike for. The weight isn't super impressive. In 2024, an enthusiast road bike can get down below 17 pounds, with some really lightweight bikes dipping below 15 pounds or even less, which is seriously light. Now, of course, weight isn't everything, and 22.5 pounds isn't really a surprise, but it's also not that heavy, and really is just something to note. I will say that if you do get the Triton and you end up really liking the bike, you can easily drop a couple of pounds by upgrading the wheels to something a little bit nicer. Now, when the total cost of the bike is $1,000, dropping an additional $800, $900 or even $1,000 on a set of carbon wheels might sound a little bit crazy, but also keep in mind that the Triton uses modern standards and through-axle hub mounting, so any wheels that you would buy for this bike would easily transfer over to a nicer bike if you choose to upgrade frames at a later time. And since we're on wheels, I will say that the stock wheels that come on the Triton are pretty basic. They're alloy rims and they're not super light, and that's fine, it is a budget bike after all. But I would say that the QC of the build process of the wheels is potentially a little bit lacking. Not in a serious way, but one indication of a quality wheel set is if the spoke tension was properly relieved during the build process. Now, during my first ride out on hard cornering or accelerations, the spokes on these wheels would pop a lot, which again isn't a safety thing or anything like that, but it is an indication that the spoke tension wasn't properly relieved during the build process. So it's actually a pretty minor gripe. And then the last sort of semi-gripe would be the build process. Now, this is complete speculation, totally unconfirmed, but I suspect that somehow Poseidon saves money on shipping by the way that they package their bikes. Now, what I mean is that a typical packaging for a bike is to remove the front wheel and the handlebars and package the bike with the rear wheel still attached. Now, this makes setup a lot easier because the builder doesn't need to set up the drivetrain or the rear brake. The Poseidon Triton ships with both wheels removed, along with the handlebars, the rear derailleur, and the disc rotors. Now, this allows the shipping box to be a lot smaller, and my guess is that it costs a lot less to ship it this way. But then the burden kind of falls on the owner to build the bike from a more disassembled state, which, I mean, it kind of does make sense. To offer this bike at this price point, there have to be some kind of cost-saving measures. However, the build process is substantially more involved than a typical bike and requires setting up the drivetrain and the brakes, which let's face it, if you're a beginner cyclist, you might not have the ability to do that. Now, in a separate collaboration with Poseidon, I put together a pretty comprehensive build video for this Triton, and even trying to be as focused and to the point as possible, it's still a 35-minute video. So while I wouldn't let the build process hinder you from buying this bike, you should be aware that it does take some mechanical wherewithal to put it together. Of course, you could pay a professional to build it up for you, but you're probably looking at $150 or so to have a reputable shop build it up for you, which, given the $1,000 price tag of the bike, isn't insignificant. Okay, well, I realize that's kind of a lot, so I'll leave it there. Overall, despite the minor gripes, I still feel that the value per dollar of the Poseidon Triton is just about as good as it gets. For $1,000 US, you're getting a really well-spec'd, smartly designed, somewhat future-proof road bike that can handle a little bit of off-road curiosity, and in late 2024, solid budget bike offerings are, well, if we're being honest, they're pretty few and far between. If you have any questions about my experience of the Triton so far, just leave them down below and we'll try to respond as many as we can. Thanks again for watching, and thanks for subscribing to the channel. If you haven't already, we'll see you next time.